Welcome everyone to the CARC data facing track call. I'm glad you're all here. If this is your first time, I have on the screen just a little summary of some of the things that the CARC organization does. It's a professional organization for research, computing, and data professionals. So we have one half, that's the People Network, which is like a year-round virtual conference about different topics. Then there's also working and interest groups that are actively working on some deliverables for the community. And if you are interested in more information about any of these, just use the links on the bottom of the slide here. So today, we're very pleased to welcome Professor Catherine D'Ignazio, co-author of the book Data Feminism. She is a scholar, artist/designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. She has run reproductive justice hackathons, designed global news recommendation systems, created talking and tweeting water quality sculptures, and led walking data visualizations to envision the future of sea level rise. With Raul Bargava, she built the platform databasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her forthcoming book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. Her research at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice has been published in the Journal of Peer Production, the Journal of Community Informatics, and the Proceedings of Human Factors in Computing Systems. Her art and design projects have won awards from the TAN Foundation, Turbulence.org, and the Knight Foundation, and exhibited at the Venice Biennial and the ICA Boston. D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She is also director of the Data Plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly in relation to space and place. And now I will hand it over to Catherine.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Deb. Thank you so much to everyone for coming out. I am always honored when people choose to spend some of your precious Zoom time with me, because our lives are so zoomed out at this point. So thank you for making time in your Zoom schedule to pass some time together today. Oh, that's a great cat, Deb. I like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have 3 cats at home, so big cat person. Okay. Just want to share my screen. So yeah, so lovely to see folks. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about Lauren Klein and I's book, Data Feminism. I want to set out a little bit of the motivation for us for writing the book. I also we like to always define feminism, because people come to that word with so many different sort of paths and histories and things that they bring. So we like to be really specific about which feminism we're mobilizing in the book. And then I want to take you on a little tour of some of the examples of work that we talk about in the book and how they illustrate feminist principles of data science. So that's our roadmap for today. And so yeah, I think the couple important things to mention before I get started are that this is a co-authored book. Lauren is not here today, but you should definitely go check out her work. She's really incredible. She runs a lab called the Digital Humanities Lab down at Emory University in Atlanta. And then the other thing to mention is that Data Feminism is open access. So you can buy it too, and it's a beautiful book, has a lot of images, but you can also just read it online for free. If you go to datafeminism.io, the website that you see at the bottom of the slide, and then click read the book, that'll take you to the website where it's published. All right. So, so Lauren and I see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that is really looking to hold corporate and government actors accountable for making racist, sexist, and classist data products. So these are things like, and probably folks on this call, like if you are kind of tracking public conversation about big data right now, you have probably heard of some of these things. So these are things like face detection systems that cannot see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and so on. And you know, the fact is that these examples keep coming out in the popular press. So these examples of these racist, sexist, classist, et cetera, sort of data products and systems. And it was in a way because they keep coming out that Lauren and I decided to write this book, because when there is reporting on a lot of these things, that it's often with this like, reported with this kind of like shock and surprise, like, oh my gosh, the algorithm is biased, or, you know, oh, the data set it's biased. Like, how could that possibly be, you know? And so we wanted to kind of trace this back and think about not only like kind of identify, well, like this is the root cause analysis of why this is biased, why we are producing these biased systems, but also talk about what are some of the ways that we address that in the design process. And so the larger critique starts out with this idea that many people have probably heard. This has been circulating for some time. You may have heard people say data is the new oil. And this is something that's circulated certainly a lot in corporate circles and global circles. And corporations say data is the new oil. And when they say that, they typically mean it in a good way. So in the idea being that data seems like this untapped natural resource that can lead to profit once it's processed and refined. And in fact, like many of the metaphors that we use when we work with data as data scientists or analysts or visualizers are things like mining, extracting, processing, cleaning, refining. All of these are metaphors of extraction, which is something that's important to think about here. So on the one hand, we have the kind of corporate community that's been doing this for a decade or longer, saying, you know, how data are the new oil, they're going to lead to all this, you know, untapped riches for everybody. And yet, in fact, you have a number of people, and in fact, a growing number of people pushing back and saying, in fact, these riches that you speak of are not coming to us, they are not being distributed equally. And then here's where we have a kind of growing group of scholars, activists, writers, organizations pushing back and saying in so many words, data, in fact, is not the new oil, but data is the same old oppression. And a lot of this work is being led by Black and Indigenous women of color, by white women, by Indigenous people, by immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more. And you know, they're saying this in a lot of different ways, and we have some of the work that's been really inspiring to us is here on the bottom of this slide, which, you know, if you're tracking this space, probably most of these examples will be familiar to you, but I'm happy to talk about them further. And so we sort of join in this growing wave of pushback. So we're not the first to make points about how data can be discriminatory, for example. We're not the first to make a lot of these different points, but what we wanted to bring into this growing conversation is how feminism and intersectional feminism in particular has a lot to offer this conversation. In fact, has a lot of conceptual tools to both analyze why social inequalities are being reproduced in data systems and data sets, and also to think about how do we interrupt that, how do we dismantle that, and so on. So I want to just take a quick detour because, we say this, if folks start speaking out now against the same old oppression, and we actually see this in a very recent case at Google. I don't know if folks have been tracking this case, but speaking out against the same old oppression carries consequences. And so this is Dr. Timnit Gebru. She was until recently the co-lead of ethical artificial intelligence at Google. She's really well known for her scholarship in machine vision, as well as her work on DEI issues in the field of artificial intelligence. She's actually a founder of a community called Black in AI, which is a community for Black researchers. The kind of quick story of this is leadership at Google had approved a paper that she and her colleagues wrote for publication, which was about the dangers of large natural language processing models. They outlined sort of these like 4 risks of doing really large scale natural language processing. Originally, Google said you can publish this paper. The paper was accepted through a peer review process. And then suddenly leadership reversed their decision and they actually told the team to retract the paper. When Dr. Gebru asked for transparency about this, they promptly fired her. And this was so sudden, and she has such a high profile and has been inspirational to so many people in this community, including myself and including Lauren. There was this really huge kind of grassroots pushback. So 2,500 Google employees have now signed a petition that demands transparency. 4,000 and growing academics and AI researchers have signed this petition. HBCU recruiting firms actually dropped Google over this. And in fact, 9 members of Congress wrote a letter demanding accountability from Google. But there wasn't any answer, no answer came back. And in fact, the way that she was treated is really shameful and shouldn't be a way that anybody is ever treated by their employer. And yet my colleagues, Dr. Caitlin Turner and Dr. Danielle Wood and I wrote a piece where we point out that in fact, her case is not an isolated case. It's so common that it's a centuries-old playbook that's used against Black women who speak truth to power. So we're in this like current moment right now. There's a real reckoning happening, I think, around these ideas of AI, data-driven systems, ethics, and who gets to participate in these conversations. And so this is why this case, like Dr. Gebru's case, matters right now, and it matters in a really big way. Because feminism as both theory and practice demands that we ask what we call who questions. So these are things that are sometimes uncomfortable. We don't typically ask these in technical fields. So things like data science by who does the work, and who is pushed out of the field. Data science for who is benefiting from the work. Data sets about whom, when you're collecting information about people, are they from your community? Are they different? How? And data science with whose values. So why are these feminist questions? So hopefully you'll understand that as we go into this definition of feminism. So what you see here is an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. And Beyonce actually projected the word feminist behind her. And she sings about the feminism in her song Flawless, where she's actually quoting the dictionary definition of a feminist. So feminist is a person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that feminism is a belief in equality for all genders. But the dictionary also has a second definition. Feminism is organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests, meaning like, if you believe all genders are equal, all you really have to do is look around and see that belief is not made manifest in the world that we live in today. So feminism implies a commitment to taking action to realize that world. So it's a belief, it's political action. And then feminism has a third definition, which I personally have always found very enriching and exciting, which is that it's a set of theories and ideas, meaning it's an intellectual heritage. It's a way of thinking, like a body of knowledge that we inherit from people who came before us so that we can face current problems and we don't have to go it alone, basically. And so these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender. But then the past 50 years of scholarship in feminism and also the current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, many more things. And this leads to the most important takeaway of the sort of which feminism we are mobilizing in the book. We assert in the book that really feminism in the year 2021 must be understood as being intersectional. This may or may not be I don't totally know who those folks are on this call, so this might be super familiar to you as a word, or maybe it's new, I don't know, but I'm going to explain it. So intersectionality is a term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. You can see here on the bottom right in the pink. And this is a term that she uses to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, such as gender. So like when we're talking about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of the many forces and factors that produce it. So that includes racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. And it's really the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have really foregrounded this conversation about forces of power. And so that leads us to this takeaway that, intersectional feminism is not only about women. And in fact, it's not only about gender. It's really about power. It's about who has power and who does not have power. And so in today's world, data is power. I mean, we can see this in a very sort of like material way, because in the work of like, who are the companies that are making the most money right now? I think somebody has a lot of background noise. Could folks mute maybe? Thank you, that's great. So we can see this idea that data is power in the sense of like, which companies are on top? They're the companies that have the means to collect, store, analyze, deploy, make products out of large stores of data. And so really the underlying argument is that intersectional feminism, when it's applied to data science, can help this power be challenged and changed. And so our argument is, in fact, that data science needs feminism, and it really needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we hope to challenge and change the unequal distribution of power in the world today. Using data science, I guess it's important to point out. Data science is going to work for justice, then intersectional feminism needs to be there. So in writing the book, Lauren and I did, we come to the table with kind of different trainings and backgrounds in various ways. And then we also did a scan of a lot of different feminist literature, in particular fields that have really tried to apply feminist theory. So looking in particular at things like law, legal scholarship, feminist economics, feminist human-computer interaction, feminist approaches to design, and so on and so forth, where like folks were trying to really like embed feminism in like a design process or a product or a architecture or something like this. And from that scan, we came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data. And our goal here was to not necessarily to make new feminist theory, but to take all the feminist theory, not all of it, look across a lot of the feminist theory that had come before us, and to really then operationalize it. So to try to say, well, like, what is the relevance of this body of work for the practice and action of data science and working with large data sets and small data sets. And so these are the principles. I won't have time today to go through every single one of them. What I will point out is that you'll note that the first two principles of this set have to do with power. So they are examine power and challenge power. And this is also the answer to the question of, a lot of times we get asked the question of, like, you know, the things that you're advocating for are basically just good data science. So, like, what makes them particularly feminist? And so the answer to that question is actually these first two principles. And so this idea that an analysis of unequal social power, this is what is at the heart of the feminist project, more than anything else. It's really centering questions of social inequality as objects of study, and trying actively to dismantle them. And so I would welcome that to be good data science, but right now that is not what data science does in any kind of like mainstream way. But hopefully we don't have to call it feminist data science. In some future, maybe it will just be good data science. But for now, it's important to say that it's feminist. And so I should say these principles are the way that the book is structured as well. And so actually there's one chapter for each of the principles. We try to assume no prior knowledge in either feminism or data. And so what we try to do is introduce you to some of the feminist thinkers who have developed these ideas and theories and introduced some of these concepts that led to the principle. And then we also show many examples of data science projects that come from a variety of different fields that are actively sort of embodying that principle. And so in fact, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to show you all a couple of examples that come out of these principles and help to illustrate them in the process. So the first one I'll talk about is called The Library of Missing Data Sets. And this is by Mimi Onuoha, who's an artist, and this is an art project. And so this is illustrating the principle of examine power. So this comes right out of the first chapter of the book. Excuse me. So missing data sets is a term that was coined by Onuoha to describe data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need, but for various reasons, they don't exist in real life. So these are things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or a more recent example, gender and race breakdown of the total number of people with COVID in the United States. So Onuoha, she exhibits this as a filing cabinet, which you see here on the left. So it's this white filing cabinet. It's set up in an exhibition context. The title or the subject of each missing data set is the tab on the file folder. So you can kind of open the drawer, look across all of the things that are listed as being missing. And then you can actually like pick up a file folder and open it up. But of course, when you open them, they're empty because there are no records. This is not something that we are collecting data about. And Onuoha is also pointing to the fact that what we choose to collect data about in the world is a political choice. And so there's a profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. Often we are talking about things like bias in algorithms and bias in data sets, and those are really important things to be talking about. And it's great to see those conversations happening. But in fact, that bias is much further up the pipeline as well. It's also where what we even choose to allocate resources to, what we choose is worthy of measuring and collecting and storing and maintaining and stewarding, because data resources, as probably I'm sure everyone on this call knows, are time and resource intensive. You need money to actively manage data, right? It doesn't manage itself. And so in any case, like here we frame, that Mimi's work helps us point to how a feminist approach to data science begins with this sort of analysis of power, with analyzing both what we do have and do measure and do collect in the world, and then, of course, what we don't. And those absences can be really telling once we start to notice them. So this next example, in fact, also relates to this idea of missing data sets. But this comes out of the chapter 2, which is about the principle of challenging power. And the missing data in this case are data that we do not have about feminicide in Mexico. So for those who don't know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They are legally defined as crimes in 18 Latin American countries at this point, including in Mexico. So the state recognizes feminicide as a crime. However, it does not systematically collect data on feminicide. So this is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So you can go look at the hashtag Ni Una Menos there. Because of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement the own laws. Like it has these laws on the books, and yet it's failing to actually measure the scope and the scale of the problem. So frustrated by this, we profile a woman in the book named Maria Salguero, who resolved to head straight towards this problem and collect the missing data herself. And so because she has been collecting these data for now over 5 years, she has single-handedly compiled the largest public archive of feminicides in Mexico. She usually spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging feminicides on a Google map that you see here and in her database that's sort of back behind this. And she does this by reading media reports. So her method is to scan media, set up different kinds of alerts, read articles. I mean, you can imagine how terrible this work is. It's like reading articles about violent death and then cataloging these in her database. So because of this, and because she's become, in a sense, like the most authoritative public source on the matter, she's ended up helping families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's testified in front of Mexico's Congress, in fact, several times about the matter. And so in data feminism, we frame this as what might be called feminist counter data. So it's a kind of an activist data collection that steps in when the state and other kinds of counting institutions are systematically failing to measure the things that matter. And so it represents one way to use data to challenge power. And there's an important caveat here, which is that collecting data is one of the strategies that we outline for using data to challenge power. It's not the only way, though, right? And when faced with a social issue, like it's not like the answer is not always like, let's go collect more data, because you can imagine ways in which collecting data, particularly if it's about vulnerable groups or marginalized groups or stigmatized groups, might expose them to harm, might make them targets of like powerful institutions if those institutions, acquire that data in some way. So it's not always the answer, but collecting counter data is one way that we can use data to challenge power. In the book, we also talk about counter data efforts like this one, which is undertaken by San Francisco's anti-eviction mapping project. And so here we're talking about the principle of embracing pluralism, which is really an argument for thinking about how do we make the data science process more participatory? How do we involve more people, especially communities who are impacted or for whom the stakes may be high of the work that we're doing. And so the anti-eviction mapping project is a community-based organization. They're actually now chapter-based, and they have chapters in a variety of cities. Since 2013, they've worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area, which is where they started. Now they're in other places. So here for the map that you're looking at, each red dot indicates a place where a person or a family was evicted. And then the blue dots indicate places where AEMP also interviewed one of the people who was evicted from that place. And if you click on the blue dot, it brings up an interview, a video interview, like the one you see here with Phyllis Bowie. And so in the book, we contrast the AEMP map and their process, in particular their process, with the map and the process of Eviction Lab. So Eviction Lab is based at Princeton University. Their goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say this is a really valuable goal. It's a worthy project, especially right now in terms of COVID, when they're like trying to collect data that other people do not have in any kind of systematic way. But where we contrast these two projects is around process. So the Eviction Lab, their goal is to acquire like data quickly at a national scale. They want to make their map. And so their maps derive from seemingly bigger data, and their map presents a seemingly more comprehensive picture of eviction in the United States. However, the AEMP has shown that national real estate databases, like the ones that Eviction Lab uses, significantly undercount evictions. And in fact, a lot of the AEMP's work of counting evictions in San Francisco is about trying to redefine and challenge what constitutes an eviction, to say like there's all of these ways that people end up being evicted that aren't ending up as logged as evictions in the actual official data. So working instead with local communities and on the ground, the AEMP has gathered much more accurate and more contextualized data that documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And so this in the book is what we talk about as embracing pluralism, and thinking about, what are the benefits and the costs of doing work quickly and at scale. And I should say that there's an interesting story too we tell in the book of where AEMP and Eviction Lab kind of butt heads, in particular over process and accountability and whether we're prioritizing quality of data over quantity of data or not. So, yes. Okay. So this example talks about the principle of rethinking binaries and hierarchies. So this is a chapter in the book that talks a lot about thinking about like what are the consequences of how we classify things, like when we classify, how we classify, and we end up talking a lot about binary structures. And feminists have a lot to say about binary structures, so things that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. And of course, the reason feminist theorists have taken this up so much is that we have, we inherit in our kind of Western society, we inherit this idea of the gender binary, right? So this idea that there are two genders only, one, men and women. And so what feminist theorists would say, well, in fact, that's a false binary, because in fact, there are not only two genders, like empirically speaking, that's untrue, right? And then not to mention that, in fact, even if we accepted that, it's not really like an equal binary, it's actually hiding a hierarchy. And so what feminist theorists have done is to say, we need to be very suspicious of binaries. When people present us with a binary, we need to be kind of deeply suspicious over what is it kind of falsely excluding, and then also what is it creating a hierarchy out of. And so other binaries that feminist theorists have kind of broadened the argument to are things like nature and culture, or subject and object, or this artificial binary that this next example talks about, is this artificial distinction between reason on the one hand and emotion on the other hand. So in an Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion, And we see this play out in data and in data visualization in particular. And so this is actually coming out of the chapter that's about the elevate emotion and embodiment. And so we're talking a lot in this chapter about emotion. So often the best practices for data visualization involve a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, a kind of just the facts, neutral sort of presentation. But here in this chapter, we challenge like why. So why are these our best practices? Especially when research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices, like being neutral with your presentation is an aesthetic choice. Like that's a rhetorical choice to make, which also has emotional consequences. So what about the opposite? So visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. And that's what this example here helps us to explore. So the large black images on top are actually screenshots of an animated visualization. And you can go look it up. It's by a design firm called Periscopic. And so this is presenting us with an animation of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States. And so each person who was killed by a gun, their life is traced as a single arc. And the arc is orange until the point of their death, because actually on the axis, the horizontal axis is a timeline. So when they reach the age where they were killed, the line, their arc shifts from being orange to being gray. And so it starts by tracing like 1 or 2, and then they speed up and they speed up and they speed up, and then they just keep going because there's so many gun deaths. And it's really overwhelming to watch, almost unbearable. And this is really the point, is that there are too many people being killed by guns in the US. Like it's an epidemic. But what's interesting about this, is that it also has these statistics. You can see the top left number of people killed, and then they have a really interesting, much more speculative statistic on the right, where they actually use a statistical model to compute how long would that person have lived, given their other demographic characteristics, if they had lived out the rest of their life. And so using that, they compute, well, how many years were stolen as this like cumulative measure. But so this, when it first came out, and this has changed now because this first came out in like 2013, but when it first came out, it was really viewed by suspicion with the visualization community because it made us feel. It's framed very much around these emotions of loss and grief, and trying to really grapple with the magnitude of that. But in fact, a feminist approach here would say that it's not a problem at all that it makes us feel things. In fact, it's a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. And in fact, it might be a more ethical visualization because it's delivering the message in a way that is sympathetic to actually the phenomenon itself. It's like a form that relates to the content that it describes, rather than describing people's lives as dots, or we contrast this actually with the kind of more generic bar chart there, right? So in fact, it could be more ethical with those reasons that it tries to honor this kind of loss that is the impact of the phenomenon of gun violence. Okay. So I think close to the end, the final point I want to make before opening it up is just to say, if you read Data Feminism, and this also might be evident from the talk, we really require and insist on an expanded definition of data science. And so our data science is not defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people who are undertaking the work. These are concerns that are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. And so what we're interested in is data science and justice. and we expand our definition to be more encompassing, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work at that intersection of data science and justice today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by librarians, by community organizers, by activists. And some of that work does look like traditional data science. And so like here, top left, you can see the work of Margaret Mitchell, in fact, who was co-lead of that Google AI, ethical AI team with Timnit Gebru, and who was also subsequently fired. She's a white woman. But this particular paper is really excellent. It's about bias in natural language processing techniques. But like, so that's a more conventional way that we're used to seeing data science sort of show up as research. But then next to Margaret's work, you have an interactive sculpture by the artist Stephanie Dinkins, where she actually trained this AI chatbot to interact with you. So you can like walk up to the sculpture and talk to it. But she trained it on a very, what we like a traditional data scientist would call a very small data set. She trained it on dialogues between herself and all of the Black women in her family. So this like intergenerational dialogue between Black women. So it answers you in a very kind of like, you know, way that's very specific to her family specifically, right? So like a kind of interesting inversion of what we want our AI chatbots to do. And then on the right is the Puddings, Inventive and Fun Data Journalism, which examines gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then on the bottom is a group called Data Therapy, who they work with community-based organizations to train them up in skills to work with their own data. So they work with community orgs to understand their own data, and then they produce what they call data murals in situ. So this was with an organization that does community gardening with youth in Somerville, Massachusetts. So we have hundreds of examples like this in the book. And you know, one of the reasons we included this wide array is because, you know, one of the things we aspire to do with data feminism is not only to point out how our systems are biased or how we are kind of perpetuating oppression, but also thinking about what are the ways in which we are pushing back on that with data science, with models, with data analysis, with data visualization, and so on. So it can be, while it is at the root of many problems today, it can also be part of the solution. So we recently were invited to be in a art exhibition. We didn't know how to exhibit a book. So we worked with the designer named Marcia Diaz, who's a fabulous designer and illustrator. And we have these infographics, which we ended up printing as it's like a really large scale poster. But if it's of interest, you can go and just download these for free as well on the website that's listed here. And we have them in several different languages at this point. So I think that's it. Happy to take questions, comments, and so on. And then these are a number of different ways that you can be in touch with us. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. That was such a great talk. Thank you so much. We did have one question in the chat. Is there some discussion in the book of the role of civic data portals or data derived from open records requests as potential sources for feminist counter data approaches?
Yeah, I love that. We do touch on that. I think it's in chapter 6. So chapter 6 is the one that's about consider context, that principle. And in that chapter, we're outlining how, yeah, just like open data in the wild can be a real recipe for disaster when we don't actually understand the context, and when we are not, you know, our informational institutions for the most part are not investing in context support, like things like producing things like metadata, data dictionaries, helping people who make, you know, come across these data understand like how were they collected, for what purpose, what are their limitations, you know, in particular, what types of analysis are appropriate, what are not, so we tell some of the sort of like pitfall stories, like the stories of what can go wrong when we fail to consider context. And then in the end, yeah, we raise some questions around like whose responsibility is context, because for the most part, it's really been, governments have like gotten behind this idea of open data, or well, for the most part. And I guess the last federal administration did not, but I think it's coming back, maybe, hopefully. And yet, the data that they are publishing are often published without context or without these metadata, which then lead to these other problems downstream. So there's like kind of an investment in just sort of publishing, but there's not like the support to actually help people move those things forward. So I think like there's definitely some interesting work that could be done around the role of civic data portals in feminist counter data approaches. Also in, I don't even know if we mentioned them in the book, but in, I would say like nonprofit groups, like folks like Muckrock, if you know about them, they're an organization that helps people, like helps to streamline the process of filing FOIA requests. And like when you're doing large projects, it helps you, they help you make requests across a lot of different jurisdictions, basically. So things like that, I think are, really fantastic, what might we say, kind of like, yeah, counter data infrastructure or something like that, like helping us to build citizen capacity to use data for accountability, basically, yeah.
And is there any work on getting this book into classrooms or data science programs?
We've heard of it being used in a lot of classrooms. So like, yeah, a lot of, I think in particular, since it was published open access, and we try to keep reminding people of that right before every semester so that they'll like pick it up and use it. But yeah, we actually have heard of a lot of people, faculty using it in pretty diverse classes, like everything from digital humanities to like very technically focused classes like natural language processing and things like that. So it kind of runs the gamut. Media studies also, but yeah, not necessarily. Yeah, I don't know if I've heard of data science, like programs that are specifically focused on data science necessarily. And then there was one person reached out to us about potentially developing like a educator's guide to it or something like that. But then I'm not sure if she ended up doing that. We said basically, yes, go do it. But yeah, but at the moment, actually, I should say maybe there's no sort of like materials beyond the book that you could use necessarily.
Any more questions? Feel free to unmute if you want. All right, that looks like all the questions then. Thank you all for coming and enjoy your gift of 9 minutes back.
It's always nice. Thank you all. I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, thanks so much for being here. Take care.